The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like 1,000 insects trapped in plastic, and Hannah Clarke had long stopped noticing them. 3 years. That's how long she'd been moving through the corridors of Sacred Heart in Raleigh, her shoes whispering against linoleum, her hands steady as they'd been trained to be. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee clung to her scrubs, the hospital uniform that let her disappear into the machinery of the place. A trauma nurse. Competent. Quiet. Invisible to anyone who mattered. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from the hospital with her 16-year-old son, and if anyone at Sacred Heart had asked about her past, she would have said nothing. The Navy ordered silence, and Hannah Clarke had learned to obey orders that came down from places she couldn't acknowledge. Her medical records from before Sacred Heart were spotless but generic. A small gap in her employment history. No explanation. No need for one. People don't ask questions when you make it clear questions aren't welcome. She kept her head down, her voice lower, and her left forearm bare despite the nurse's station being perpetually cold. The tattoo on her inner wrist, coordinates and nothing else, stayed hidden under long sleeves, even in summer. The night shift at Sacred Heart had its own rhythm. Between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m., the hospital became a different animal. The visiting hours were over. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer somehow, or maybe that was just the exhaustion that accumulated in those dark hours. The ER was never quiet, but it had a different quality of noise after midnight, more urgent, less bureaucratic. Hannah moved through it like someone who'd been trained to operate in spaces where seconds mattered. She caught details others missed. The way a patient's breathing changed before the monitor showed it. The subtle shift in skin color that meant perfusion was failing. The 1,000th time a resident missed the fact that a patient's pupils were unequal. She wore the same uniform as 30 other nurses. Her badge had her photo and her name and the title RN on it. Nothing else. Sometimes she'd feel the weight of the worn combat boots in her locker downstairs, the only proof she kept of who she'd been, and she'd push the feeling away. The boots belonged to someone else. Someone who didn't exist anymore. The waiting area on the 3rd floor was half full when the ambulance radio crackled. Incoming trauma. Blunt force injury, multiple contusions, shrapnel embedded near the lumbar spine. The voice on the radio was crisp, professional. Vital stable. One complicating factor, patient was blind from a previous IED incident, lost his sight 6 years ago. Hannah was finishing a chart when Dr. Patterson came through the ER doors, already shaking his head before he'd even assessed the patient. She watched it happen the way you watched a weather pattern form, inevitable, predictable. Patterson was a good surgeon, technically. But he couldn't see past the liability. The blind man in the trauma bay represented a complication that would take extra time, extra documentation, extra risk of a lawsuit if something went wrong. Not taking this one, Patterson said to the attending, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that made it clear the matter was closed. Too many variables. Can't get proper consent if he can't see the monitors. Shrapnel near the spine means one wrong move and you're looking at permanent paralysis. Not my service. Dr. Chen came next, the emergency physician who'd built a reputation on efficiency and outcomes. He spent 8 minutes with the patient, then stepped back, arms crossed. Lost cause, he said quietly. Not cruel, exactly. Just factual in the way some people deliver facts like they're reading from a manual. Infection risk is too high with that contamination profile. Even if we manage the shrapnel, the underlying tissue damage is extensive. I'm not committing resources to a case with a projected survival rate below 30%. Dr. Yamamoto from orthopedics laughed, not unkindly, but without warmth, when the resident paged her. Insurance complications, she said. Complex procedures on blind patients create documentation nightmares. Liability chain gets murky. I'm not touching that without a risk management review, which means delay, which means the window for treatment closes anyway. Not my department. The word spread the way words do in hospitals. 12 doctors turned down the case. Not all in the same way. Some cited liability. Some cited resource allocation. Some simply walked past the trauma bay without stopping, which was its own kind of refusal. The surgical chief, Dr. Hargrove, was the last away in, and he did it with the kind of authority that came from 23 years of climbing the institutional ladder. Not taking this, Hargrove said, loud enough that half the ER could hear. He was a tall man with grey at his temples and the kind of face that had learned how to wear authority like expensive cologne. This patient represents a significant drain on departmental resources. My quarterly metrics are already under scrutiny with the board. I'm not spending 40 hours of surgical time on a blind trauma patient with minimal salvage potential. Not on my watch. The way he said it made it clear this wasn't medicine. This was about numbers on a spreadsheet. Resource allocation. The patient had stopped being a person the moment his condition became inconvenient. Hannah watched from the nursing station, her hand still moving across the keyboard, her face showing nothing. I'll take the overnight monitoring. Her voice was quiet. Not soft, exactly. Quiet in the way that made people turn toward you without realizing they were doing it. I can keep him stable until we get a surgical consult from one of the other departments. Hargrove turned and looked at her like she'd spoken in a language he didn't recognize. His eyes went over her the way his eyes went over every nurse at Sacred Heart, present but unseeing. A uniform. Interchangeable competence. His smile was the kind that didn't involve his eyes. Overnight, sure, he said. You'll last about a week before you realize you're in over your head. These complex cases burn out staff. He turned away before she could respond, and that was the moment Hannah understood that she'd just volunteered for something Dr. Hargrove was already prepared to punish her for. The patient's name was Marcus Reed. He was 34 years old, former Navy SEAL, and when the orderlies wheeled him into the observation room at 1 a.m, Hannah recognized him the way you recognize a landmine, not from looking at it directly, but from the way everything around it changes. She knew him because 7 years ago, before the Navy erased her records and ordered her to disappear, she had carried him. He had been 19 then, a corpsman attached to her team, and a round had gone through his abdomen and lodged near his spine. She'd made the call to get him 3 miles through hostile territory to an extraction point, had applied pressure bandages with one hand while keeping her rifle ready with the other, had talked him through the pain in a voice that showed nothing of the fear underneath. The scar tissue on his abdomen was still there. So was the shrapnel. But his eyes were gone, milky white, sightless, the product of a separate incident from the second deployment. He couldn't see her. That was almost a relief. Vitals are stable, Hannah said to the resident assisting her, her voice maintaining the professional distance that made her a good nurse. I'll monitor his pressure every 15 minutes. Watch for fever or signs of infection. The shrapnel site is clean for now, but we'll need imaging before any surgical intervention. Marcus was conscious. Restless in the way of people in pain. His hands moved across the hospital bed, trying to make sense of his surroundings through touch. There was a tattoo on his left arm, new, or at least newer than she remembered. A name. Her name. Hannah. He didn't know the voice belonged to her. Couldn't know. She was just a nurse now, someone with competent hands and a steady demeanor. He was just a patient, someone from a life that officially no longer existed. The Navy had made that clear when they'd shuffled her out of active duty and told her she was on medical leave that somehow became permanent. They told her the operation in Kandahar never happened. That the men she'd saved never existed either. That she was supposed to walk away and not look back. "Can you hear me, Petty Officer Reed?" she said, using his rank like a shield. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough from the pain medication and the pain itself. "Where am I?" Sacred Heart Hospital. Raleigh, North Carolina. You came in with shrapnel complications. I'm going to get you through the night, and we'll figure out the next step in the morning. She could have told him. Could have said, "It's me. I'm here. I never forgot." Could have let him know that the reason his name was on his arm was being addressed. Could have bridged the 7-year gap of silence. Instead, she adjusted his monitored his oxygen saturation, and kept watch over him the way a senior chief petty officer had been trained to keep watch over their people. Quietly. Without expectation of recognition. Without needing to be seen. The night was going to be long. And that wasn't even the worst part. The night stretched into the next morning's shift, and that's when Dr. Hargrove made his entrance through the nurse's station like a man who owned the place. He did own a piece of it, 3 decades of seniority, a network of board members who returned his calls, and a reputation for eliminating anything that threatened his metrics. Hannah was updating charts when he announced it loud enough for everyone to hear. That nurse taking the seal case. He gestured toward her without looking. She'll quit within a week. Who wants in on the pool? $50 says she's done by Friday. 2 nurses laughed. One actually pulled out her wallet. The third, Jennifer, who'd worked beside Hannah for 2 years, looked at her shoes and said nothing. Hannah didn't look up from the chart. Her hands kept moving. Pen steady. Each letter precise. The same hands that had once stabilized a femoral artery bleed with nothing but gauze and pressure, 3 miles from any extraction point, under fire that made the desert seem alive with sound. She turned the page. Kept writing. The pool filled to $230 before Hargrove lost interest and moved on, satisfied by the simple mathematics of publicly doubting her. The next afternoon, the cafeteria collision happened at 14:22. Hannah was carrying her lunch tray, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee in a ceramic mug that had survived 3 tours, when Dr. Hargrove emerged from the service line. He didn't stumble. He didn't trip. He deliberately stepped into her path and swept the tray upward with the back of his hand like he was swatting at an insect. The sandwich landed on the floor. Coffee exploded across the tile like a dark stain that looked almost like blood. The apple rolled under a table. Everyone in the cafeteria turned. Everyone watched. Hargrove didn't stop walking. He just said, "Clumsy," as he passed her. Hannah stood there. Breath in. Breath out. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent. She picked up the pieces of her lunch while 30 people pretended not to watch. When she stood, her hands were perfectly steady. The tray was clean. She walked to the trash without hesitation and without fury, which was worse for him than any angry response could have been. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, Hannah was pulling patient charts for the day's shift when Hargrove appeared in the hallway outside the supply room. He had Marcus Reed's file in one hand and a stack of her recent documentation in the other. Without a word, he threw them, across the hallway so they scattered like snow across the tile floor. Papers scattered everywhere. Charts bent. Tabs torn. "Pick that up, sweetheart." It wasn't a request. The tone made that clear. 3 other staff members were nearby. 2 nurses. A respiratory tech. All of them suddenly very interested in their phones. Hannah took one measured breath. Let her shoulders drop a 1/4 inch. She looked directly at Hargrove, not through him, not past him, but at him, and felt a single tear escape down her left cheek. She wiped it away slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact. Her voice came out quiet. Almost conversational. "I've steadied my hands under worse pressure than you'll ever know." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the sound of her boots on tile as she knelt to collect the papers. Not hurried. Not defeated. Just methodical. Each page gathered carefully, each chart replaced in its proper order. She kept her breathing controlled, kept her movement smooth, kept the terrible composure of someone who'd made peace with things Dr. Hargrove would never understand. He didn't have a response. People like Hargrove never expected the target to refuse to break. He stood there for several seconds, watching her work, then walked away without saying anything else. But his jaw was clenched. His hands were fists. He'd struck at her and she hadn't flinched, and that was a problem he needed to solve. What happened next happened in the shadows of institutional authority, where Hargrove lived like a submarine in deep water. That afternoon, he made a phone call to Dr. Marcus Sterling, his former chief of staff who now sat on the hospital board. He didn't mention Hannah by name at first. He just said there was a concerning pattern with one of the trauma nurses, someone with an unclear background, someone making questionable medical decisions, someone who might represent liability. Sterling said he'd look into it. By evening, Hargrove had contacted Hannah's previous employer in Charlotte, asking specific questions to his former colleagues there. Had she ever been disciplined? Any incident reports? Any reason she'd left? The answers came back cautious and vague, nothing concrete, nothing that could be weaponized directly. So he escalated. The next morning, an external HR investigator named Patricia Voss showed up at Sacred Heart with a folder and a list of questions for Hannah Clarke regarding her credentials, her employment history, and her training certifications. Voss had been hired by Hargrove through a consulting firm that had no connection to the hospital on paper. She was thorough and polite and asked questions in ways that made everything sound suspicious. Your military background, Voss said, reviewing documents. You have nursing certifications from Fort Sam Houston, correct? Hannah nodded. And before that? What was your role in the military? Trauma medical training. Field operations. But your records seem incomplete. Why would that be? Hannah said nothing. The silence stretched. Voss made a note. This was Hargrove's real weapon, not his hands or his voice, but his network. His ability to pick up a phone and have people mobilize, people with letterhead and authority and access to systems that could slow down, question, and undermine. He couldn't fire her yet. He needed documentation. He needed evidence. But he was building a file, and every page that went into that file was another piece of the cage he was constructing around her. Hannah understood what was happening because she'd seen institutional pressure work before, had watched it deployed, had studied how bureaucratic systems could strangle someone slowly while everyone pretended it was just procedure. Hargrove was competent. That made him dangerous in ways that angry men with loud voices never quite were. And then the intercom crackled. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. EMS inbound, 14 minutes. The next voice they heard wasn't human, it was a helicopter. The sixth night shift began like all the others. Marker stable but deteriorating. His oxygen saturation hovering at 94%, his breathing shallow, the rhythm off in a way that made Hannah's chest tighten even as she moved through the ward with the casual efficiency of someone who belonged there. She checked his vitals at 11:17 p.m. 12:53 a.m. 1:41 a.m. The numbers were a language nobody else was reading. At 2:38 in the morning, Marcus stopped breathing the way he had been and started breathing the way dying people do. The change was small at first. A pause between breaths that lasted a half-second too long. Then a pulling inward, his ribs retracting like something was hollowing him from the inside. Hannah was at the medication station 3 rooms away when she heard it, not a sound, but the absence of the right sound. The ventilator's rhythm breaking. The monitors beginning to sing their warning song, high and urgent and alone in the dark hallway. She moved before her brain caught up to what her hands already knew. Dr. Patel was the on-call resident, a third year who'd spent the last 18 months learning that liability and caution were the same word. He arrived at Marcus's room exactly 37 seconds after the alarm, moving with the careful steps of someone walking into a fire he wasn't sure he wanted to extinguish. His face went pale the moment he looked at the monitor. Tachycardia spiking to 142. Oxygen saturation crashing. 72. 68. The numbers dropping like an elevator with cut cables. We need to, I'll call Dr. Hargrove, Patel said, backing toward the door. Call him later, Hannah said. Her voice had changed. The careful, deferential nurse who asked permission had left the building. What remained was something else entirely. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Now. Patel hesitated. The hesitation lasted 2 seconds, which in a moment like this was an eternity. Hannah didn't wait for him to move. She was already opening the crash cart, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in sandstorms under gunfire, who'd crouched over bleeding Marines in alleyways where the next sound could be your last. The needle was in her palm before Patel's brain caught up to what she was actually doing. "We can't just, he needs intubation, we need an OR, we need." His trachea's deviating, Hannah said, and she was already prepping the site, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers finding the landmarks with the certainty of a pilot reading a map she'd memorized years ago. Tension pneumothorax. His lungs collapsed. "If we wait for the OR heal code before we reach it." She didn't ask permission again. Her hands moved, and the muscle memory took over, the memory that lived in her bones from a classified operation in Kandahar that the Pentagon had tried to erase, from a night when she was something other than a trauma nurse, from a moment when she'd carried a bleeding Navy SEAL named Marcus Reed 3 miles through enemy fire with his blood soaking through her flak jacket and his hand gripping her collar like she was the only solid thing left in a world that was dissolving. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was like a single breath released from a lung that had been holding it too long. The monitors shifted. 68. 72. The numbers climbing. 79. 85. Her free hand was already checking placement, already moving to secure it, already doing 3 things at once while Patel stood frozen, watching her work like she was speaking a language he'd studied for years but never actually heard spoken aloud. 88. 90. 92. Stable. The room went so quiet you could hear the refrigerator humming in the break room 3 doors down. Hannah's hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Everything about her was steady in a way that Patel would spend the next 6 months trying to understand and failing. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't asking for backup. She was checking the oxygen saturation, checking the breath sounds, checking everything with the precision of a surgeon and the calm of someone who'd already survived the worst the world had to offer. "Get a chest tube kit from supply," she said, still in that voice that wasn't quite an order and wasn't quite a request. "And call surgical. Tell them we need them now. Not eventually. Now." Patel moved. Actually moved this time, like her voice had suddenly become gravity. Hannah stepped back from the monitor, and that's when she caught it, his left arm, exposed where the hospital gown had shifted during the crisis. The tattoo. Her name in letters the size of a man's thumbnail, inked in blue-black ink by someone in a field hospital in Kabul, put there by a blind man who was trying to make sure that when he lost his vision he wouldn't lose the memory of the last person who'd held him together. She was looking at her own name on another person's skin when the on-call surgical team crashed through the doors. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Hargrove arrived 7 minutes later, took one look at what Hannah had done, the secured needle decompression, the climbing oxygen levels, the patient stabilized enough to move to the OR, and something dark and calculating moved behind his eyes. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't acknowledge what everyone in that room already knew, that a trauma nurse had just performed a procedure that belonged in a surgeon's hands, had performed it better than the surgeon in the room could have, had performed it with a competence that couldn't be explained by a 3-year nursing degree and a compassionate heart. Dr. Hargrove looked at Hannah for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned to Patel and said, "Get me her procedural log. Everything from the last 72 hours. And I want it documented that this resident authorized this course of treatment." That was when Hannah understood something she'd been trying not to understand. She had just handed Dr. Hargrove the weapon he'd been looking for. She had just proven beyond any doubt that she knew things, could do things, had a level of medical and tactical competence that didn't fit the narrative of a trauma nurse with 6 years of experience. She had just shown him something he would spend the next 48 hours trying to destroy. The helicopter rotors were already spinning on the roof. Marcus was already being prepped for the surgical suite. And Hannah Clarke, Senior Chief Petty Officer, classified operative, woman with no official existence, was already understanding that the silence in this hospital was about to become very, very loud. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She moved toward the medication station and started charting, every entry perfect, every notation precise, every detail documented, because she had learned long ago that competence was the only currency that actually mattered, and that sometimes it was the only kind of armor that worked. Dr. Hargrove arrived 20 minutes after the monitors stabilized, his Italian loafers clicking against the trauma bay tile with the precision of a metronome counting down someone else's ruin. Hannah had finished the charting. Every notation pristine. Every entry defensible. She documented the needle insertion depth, the pressure release, the O2 trajectory from 68% climbing to 94, then steady at 98. The room had been silent after Marcus's oxygen saturation climbed, that holy silence trauma teams know when death steps back and lets the patient breathe. One of the residents had whispered, "She just saved his life," and Hannah had nodded once, removed her gloves, and continued working like she'd simply restocked a supply cart. Dr. Hargrove's face told her everything. Not shock. Not gratitude. Recognition that the hierarchy he'd spent 15 years building had just cracked like old mortar. She watched him scan the chart, his eyes moving faster, his breathing tightening. The other physicians had scattered, back to their rounds, their offices, anywhere but the bay where a trauma nurse had executed a procedure that required either 30 years of experience or the kind of muscle memory that came from doing it in sandstorms under gunfire. One of them had looked at Hannah differently. That was the problem. She'd challenged the order of things. She'd stepped outside her lane. She'd made herself impossible to ignore, which meant she had to become impossible to keep. This documentation, Dr. Hargrove said, his voice carrying the texture of someone rehearsing a script he'd already written before he arrived. This is a violation of protocol. Hannah kept her hand steady on the chart. The procedure saved his life. That's not the question. He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and bitter, like money trying to smell like power. The question is whether a nursing staff member performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. The question is chain of command. She turned to face him fully, and for exactly 3 seconds neither of them moved. The ventilator wheezed. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The fluorescent panel above them hummed at a frequency that would have driven most people insane, but Hannah had learned to ignore it in operating theaters where the sound of helicopters and small arms fire made hospital machinery feel like a lullaby. He was flatlined, she said. Her voice carried the quality of something that had already decided its own outcome. "You called the code." I responded. Dr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He'd expected pushback, argument, emotion, some break in her composure that would give him leverage. What he got instead was a woman describing facts like she was reading a weather report. "You're done here, Hannah. Turn in your badge. You're being terminated for failure to follow proper chain of command and for overstepping your professional authority." It wasn't a request. It was a command. She set down her pen. Removed her badge, a laminated rectangle with her photograph from 3 years ago, before she'd learned to smile less. Before she'd fully understood that being invisible required practicing invisibility every single day. The badge hit the countertop with a sound like a coin flip landing on concrete. Heads or tails? Dead or alive? Stay or disappear? Security will escort you out, he added. His voice had found its rhythm again, the confidence of someone whose phone calls had already been made, whose network had already mobilized. He'd known he was firing her before he walked in. The documentation violation was theater. She'd just given him the excuse he needed by being too good at her job. 30 minutes later, Hannah cleared her locker. The cardboard box, a standard issue, 12 by 8 inches, holding maybe 4 days of actual possessions, filled quickly. A spare stethoscope. 2 extra pens. A granola bar she'd forgotten about. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, the worn combat boots. The tread was nearly gone. The leather had cracked in places where boots crack after they've been through worse than weather. Kandahar dust never fully came out of the seams. She'd tried cleaning them once, years ago, and gave up because the boots seemed to remember where they'd been, seemed to want to keep that testimony written into their fabric. She held them for maybe 5 seconds. Thought about throwing them into the trash bin by the employee lounge. They were useless now. They were proof of something that didn't exist anymore, a woman the Navy had officially erased, a person whose service records were classified beyond the reach of anyone she could ever call for help. Admitting she'd served meant federal charges. Admitting she'd survived Kandahar meant violating explicit orders. She'd been told the operation would be scrubbed from all records, that her name would be redacted from every file, that she would never officially exist in any capacity that could be documented or verified. The boots were the only proof. These leather scraps were the only thing proving she'd carried Marcus through fire, that she'd kept his heart beating with her hands while helicopters screamed overhead and rounds pinged off rock formations. But boots were just boots. Anyone could own boots. She put them back in the bag. Put the bag in the box. Carried the box past the security guard who wouldn't meet her eyes and out through the employee entrance where the rain was just starting to fall. Not hard yet. Just enough to darken the asphalt in long, quiet strokes. 3 days later, Hannah sat in a waiting room at the VA hospital on Blue Ridge Road, the same hospital where she'd pulled shifts as a contractor, treating the men and women who came through with the kind of injuries that reminded her why she'd never actually left the service, not really, not in any way that mattered. She was waiting to see a physician now. Not as a provider. As a patient. The intake form had blanks she couldn't fill. Medical history. Current medications. Emergency contact. She'd left those sections empty and nobody had stopped her. The boot sat in a locker in the women's changing area. She'd stared at them for 20 minutes before taking a seat in the vinyl chair across from a Marine with a prosthetic leg and a Marine with half his face rebuilt with grafts, both of them probably wondering why this woman in plain clothes was sitting among them. They didn't recognize her. Nobody ever did once she took off the scrubs. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and coffee that had been sitting in a pot since before dawn. Rain hammered the windows in waves, each burst harder than the last. The clock on the wall read 2:38 a.m. She'd come in the middle of the night because that's when people didn't ask questions, when the intake staff moved like ghosts through their shifts and didn't really look at your face. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something deeper and uglier, the trembling that comes from understanding you've been erased completely, that you have no leverage and no recourse, that the only choice left is to stop existing and see if that finally feels like peace. She'd counted her cash in the parking lot, $47.63. Not enough for a motel. Not enough for much of anything. Her phone had died. Her apartment lease was month to month and she had maybe 17 days before she couldn't pay it. The job at Sacred Heart was gone, any reference would torpedo her employment elsewhere. The only institutions that might hire her were the ones that didn't ask questions, didn't require background checks, didn't care if you showed up with nothing except the ability to work 20-hour shifts for minimum wage. She'd trained for 18 years to be invisible, and apparently, that training was finally complete. The rain grew louder. Sheets of it hammering the glass like applause or accusation, she couldn't tell anymore which was which. She thought about throwing the boots away. About walking out of the VA hospital and finding a dumpster behind a closed restaurant and letting those leather scraps disappear into the general wreckage of things nobody wanted anymore. They were evidence of a person who didn't exist. They were proof of something she'd been ordered to deny. They were. Thunder rolled across the city. A long, sustained sound like artillery, like someone firing across a valley you'd already crossed once and promised yourself you'd never cross again. And underneath it, something else. A sound that didn't belong in a hospital waiting room at 2:38 a.m. A sound that made the Marine with the prosthetic leg turn his head toward the window. A sound like a helicopter's rotors, still distant but getting closer. The morning light filtered through the administrator's office windows with the color of old bone. Hannah sat in the leather chair across from the hospital board representative, her fingers steady as she signed the final severance document. 3 days unemployed and the pen still didn't shake. Beside her, Dr. Hargrove leaned against the mahogany credenza with his arms crossed, that smile playing at the corners of his mouth like he'd won something that mattered. The document slid across the desk. Name. Date. 8:38 a.m. Done. She'd packed her locker in 4 minutes, trauma shears, stethoscope, the pair of worn combat boots she kept at the bottom under her street clothes. Everything that proved she'd been here. Hargrove's voice came low and satisfied. Best decision for everyone. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge the words with anything but the slightest exhale through her nose. He was already reaching for his phone when the office door exploded inward. Her 16-year-old son, Ethan, stood in the doorway breathing hard, his backpack hanging from one shoulder. In his hands he held a shadow box, mahogany frame, glass front, military ribbons arranged in precise rows like soldiers standing at attention. He looked at his mother with eyes that held some ancient clarity she recognized from the mirror. "Mom, they need to see these." The room crystallized. The board representative's hand froze above the papers. Hargrove's phone lowered. Hannah felt something shift in her sternum, a door opening that she'd welded shut 15 years ago. Ethan stepped forward and positioned the shadow box on the administrator's desk with the reverence of someone placing a flag over a coffin. His voice came steady and clear. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke." The silence that followed tasted like copper. Like ozone. Like the moment before lightning strikes. The head nurse appeared behind Ethan in the doorway, the same nurse who'd covered Hannah's shifts without complaint, who'd watched the public humiliation unfold across 6 months without flinching. She held a file folder, manila, and unmarked, her hands trembling as she approached the desk. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone about to detonate something institutional. 2 Purple Hearts. Kandahar deployment, 2009 to 2011. She opened the file and read the dates aloud, each one a hammer blow against the glass conference table. The board representative's face had gone the color of old newsprint. Hannah sat motionless, her hands resting in her lap with the same composure she'd maintained through every insult, every thrown chart, every cafeteria tray. But her throat had closed. Ethan reached over and squeezed her shoulder once, a gesture so simple it nearly broke her. The door opened again. A Navy SEAL team leader in dress blues, the same man who'd been visiting Marcus in his hospital room for the past week, stepped inside with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His name tag read Holloway. His voice came quiet and precise, every word a rank. Silver Star for Exceptional Valor Under Fire, Kandahar Province, March 2010. Navy Cross for Extraordinary Heroism during a classified extraction operation. He turned to face Hannah directly. "You brought us home when command said it wasn't possible." The board representative actually sat down. Hargrove's face had drained to the color of hospital walls. 2 Pentagon officials in dark suits appeared in the hallway behind Holloway, their shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of authority descending. The one with the scar across his left temple stepped forward and placed a classified briefing document on the desk. Senior Chief Clarke was the lead medical officer on Operation Nightingale. She extracted a United States Senator's daughter from a compound in Helmand Province while under active fire. That operation saved a life that went on to prevent a terrorist attack inside our borders. He paused. "Let that weight settle. The Senator's daughter is sitting in Congress now. Your institution just fired the woman who saved her life because a department head was afraid of transparency." Hargrove made a sound, not quite a word, more like air being released from something that had been under pressure too long. The security guard who'd handed Hannah the cardboard box of her belongings that morning, the same guard who'd watched her walk out in the rain with everything she owned compressed into cheap brown paper, appeared in the office doorway. He held an identical box. He looked at Dr. Hargrove and his voice came with the finality of a door closing. "I believe you know the way out." Hargrove's hand came up as if he was about to speak, to defend himself with the institutional machinery he'd spent 15 years assembling. But the Pentagon official simply turned away from him. The room's entire gravity had shifted. He was no longer the center of anything. He was the exit sign nobody wanted to watch. 3 nurses had already appeared in the hallway beyond, they'd heard everything, and they watched him pass with the kind of silence that ends careers. 6 months later, Hannah ran the Veterans Trauma Program at Sacred Heart, her name on the office door with her rank listed underneath in gold lettering. The trauma bay had been expanded, 2 additional surgical suites added specifically for complex cases that other hospitals refused. She trained nurses in tactical combat casualty care and taught them how to hold steady under pressure that most people couldn't imagine. Marcus walked into the hospital one Tuesday morning with Holloway beside him, his vision fully restored by a specialist Hannah had recruited from Johns Hopkins, a surgeon who'd served as a trauma doc in Kandahar and understood the difference between doing the paperwork and actually saving lives. Marcus carried a walking stick not because he needed it to navigate but because he carried it like a weapon he'd earned. He took Hannah's hand in the corridor outside the surgical wing and squeezed it once. 20 years, he said. I've had your name on my arm for 20 years. Couldn't see your face until last week. She looked at this man she'd carried through enemy fire, this blind soldier who trusted her voice in the dark, and said the only thing that mattered. You're home now. A former colleague mentioned in passing that Dr. Hargrove had surfaced again. 6 months after his termination, he was selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall in Raleigh, his medical license suspended pending investigation into the fraudulent documentation he'd fabricated against Hannah. The name tag on his polo shirt read, Steve, in faded letters. He flinched visibly when anyone called him doctor, the way a burned hand flinches from heat. His board connections had evaporated the moment his cowardice became a federal liability. Nobody called him anymore. Nobody returned his emails. The institutional protection he'd spent 15 years building had dissolved the instant it came into contact with actual authority. He'd learned what Hannah had known all along: real power isn't a title. It's the ability to help. It's the capacity to steady your hands under fire and do what matters when everything else is burning. Subscribe to see more stories about people who've seen the worst and learned how to give the most. Like this video if you believe institutional accountability matters. Comment, have you ever underestimated someone who turned out to be exactly who you needed? You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior.